All right. So to start off, I wanted to remind us all about the Act on Climate, which was a landmark climate law that was passed in 2021 that requires that the state reduce its emissions according to 4 benchmarks. So the first one is 10% below 1990 levels by 2020. And then we have 45% by 2030, 80% by 2040, and then net zero emissions by 2050. And Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management releases their greenhouse gas emissions inventory where they track, the status of how they're doing. And they actually just released their 2021 inventory on Monday. And if you can see here in 2020, there was a decrease, and then in 2021, emissions actually went back up. And that is not surprising. That is because there was a big global event in 2020 called COVID-19 that basically, halted a lot of transportation, reducing transportation emissions, especially from aviation. And then it also was a warmer year than normal, so heating emissions were a lot less as well. And so it's not surprising that emissions did go back up in 2021, still below the mandate of 10% below 1990 levels by 2020. But the state has a long way to go from 10% to 45% in 2030. And unfortunately, the state is not on track. So the EC4, the Executive Climate Change Coordinating Council, is sort of the interagency council that's responsible for overseeing the implementation of the Act on Climate and basically how we're going to achieve these goals. And they came out with a plan in 2020 that had some high-level modeling. So this is, maybe not 100% accurate, but it estimated that if they do everything in their plan, they will only achieve 40% emissions reductions by 2030. And that's if they do everything in their plan, which they have not started doing everything. And so that is where we come in, where we have been pushing the state to adopt stronger policies through the legislature, which is what I'll mostly be talking about today.
Can you click OK at the top of the screen? I'm OCD.
Oh, yes. Is there a way to get rid of this?
Maybe that will just go away.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So the Rhode Island Greenhouse Gas Emissions Inventory for 2021, as I said, just came out on Monday. And so this is hot off the press, new numbers, and transportation is still the largest sector, making up 37.7% of the state's emissions. But heating is a very, very close second. If you add up both residential heating, commercial heating, industrial heating, and then natural gas distribution, that adds up to 37.1% emissions. So heating is just behind transportation, and is the sector that the state is the least on track in terms of reducing emissions. And so that's where most of our work lies. And then electricity makes up 18.4% of the state's emissions. And so you'll notice that we like to think of like achieving the Act on Climate in terms of these 3 key sectors: the transportation sector, the heating sector, and the electricity sector. And so I've kind of framed my presentation under those 3 main sectors. So going into the electricity sector first, big picture here, this is the sector that we are the most on track in. And that is thanks to the 100% renewable energy standard that passed in 2022, I believe. And that requires that all the state's electricity come from renewable sources by the year 2033. And we are going to be within striking distance of that, in large part thanks to offshore wind. So we have 400 megawatts coming online from Revolution Wind, which is currently under construction and expected to be up and running, I believe by the end of the year, but it might get pushed out to early next year. And then we also have a request for proposals out right now for an additional 1,200 megawatts of offshore wind. And so the bids have been submitted for that. We did receive, I believe, 3 bids from Avangrid, Ørsted, and South Coast. And the state is currently reviewing the bids along with the utility, Rhode Island Energy. and they're expected to select a winner, hopefully by late summer. So big picture here, mostly on track. You know, there's certainly more work to be done to expand renewables. We need things like energy storage and to improve our grid and transmission. But because we're the most on track in the electricity sector compared to transportation and buildings, most of our work and most of this presentation is going to focus on those other two sectors. But with that being said, there were a couple of electricity sector wins this session. So the first one was the Energy Storage Citizens Act, Senate Bill 2499 and House Bill 7811. This passed both chambers and is expected to be signed, if it hasn't already been signed, by Governor McKee. And this basically sets an energy storage system, so battery storage, capacity goals of the following on the screen. I won't read them to you. And then it also requires that Rhode Island Energy issue a solicitation for battery storage based on if the Public Utilities Commission finds that it's necessary to improve the grid, which, spoiler alert, it's very necessary. I don't even know why that was included in there. And then it also calls for the PUC to study the appropriate procurement targets that Rhode Island Energy should set. And then, sorry, the PUC is the Public Utilities Commission. And then it also directs the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank in collaboration with our Office of Energy Resources, OER, to develop a program to meet that battery storage capacity goals. And then here I just have a picture of one of our large scale battery storage facilities in Burrillville, Rhode Island. And then another win in the electricity sector was the Renewable Ready program. This has to do with responsibly siting solar and encouraging solar on, responsible sites such as, brownfields, former contaminated sites, multi-use and multi-purpose sites like carport canopies and on top of municipal buildings, or on state properties or highways, state properties adjacent to highways or major roads. And so basically it requires that OER and DEM, our two environmental state agencies, to compile a list of those locations and how much capacity they have to host renewable energy. And then it also calls for the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank to develop a renewable ready fund to help fund the development of renewable energy installation and interconnection costs on those sites. So this is a good bill to encourage solar in responsible areas and kind of is a next step from the bill that passed last year, that the solar siting bill that requires basically you can't build solar in import forests. So next sector is the transportation sector. Again, accounts for 38% of Rhode Island's emissions. And in order to address emissions from the transportation sector, there's really two key things we need to do. One is to electrify all vehicles on our roads. And then two is to reduce vehicle miles traveled through mode shift. So getting people out of their personally owned cars and onto public transit or walking or biking. And Rhode Island is, not on track with either of these goals, but especially on the reducing vehicle miles traveled front. Last year, through regulation, the state did adopt Advanced Clean Cars 2 and Advanced Clean Trucks, which are really big standards that basically require all light duty vehicles that are being sold in the year 2035 to be zero emission. And so that's a big step in terms of electrifying vehicles on our roads. But like I said, certainly more to be done on reducing VMT and also increasing charging infrastructure to be able to support all of those vehicles. So on that charging infrastructure note, our top priority this year, and when I say our, I mean Green Energy Consumers, was House Bill 7353 and Senate Bill 2510. It basically requested that Rhode Island Energy propose new electric vehicle programs to the Public Utilities Commission. When our utility was formerly National Grid, they did have some pilot EV programs up and running, and those were discontinued and have not been picked up again by Rhode Island Energy. And so we wanted the legislature to apply some pressure for them to continue those programs, but not only continue them, but to expand them. So we called for them to have incentives for wiring upgrades and electric vehicle chargers for, all segments. So residential, workplace, fleet, and public charging. We called for a higher level of incentives for low-income drivers or people who live in disadvantaged communities. And then we also called for off-peak charging rebates that account for all the benefits of shifting load off-peak. So this is basically where if you have an electric vehicle and you charge it when the grid isn't stressed, you would get a rebate for doing that. And we were calling on them to account for things like improved transmission and distribution costs and things like that, that they should account when they're considering the amount of rebate that they should give you. And then we also called for offerings for people who live in multi-unit dwellings, such as pole-mounted chargers, as not everyone has a driveway that they can have a charger in. And so this unfortunately did not pass, but it did result in some movement. The utility is actually planning to file their EV programming with the Public Utilities Commission late summer, early fall. We have not seen what's in it yet, so to be determined if it's any good, but it is a step in the right direction, and I'm actually going to be getting to meet with them and see their plan next week. So I'll keep you all posted on if it's a good plan or not. And then our mode shift priority was the Save RIPTA campaign, where we originally, the starting ask was a budget appropriation of $78 million to fund RIPTA, our public transit. And that was in addition to Governor McKee's proposed $10 million that he had originally put in the budget. And that was to fund $8 million to close the current deficit, $24 million to raise driver salaries. They're having a big problem with driver retention at RIPTA. And then $46 million to actually expand service and implement the Transit Master Plan, which is a great plan that the state has had just sitting on the shelf for a few years now. Really gets at how we can reduce vehicle miles traveled and therefore reduce emissions. And so the end result was they ended up getting $15 million allocated to RIPTA through the budget. And, while that was not the whole ask, which the whole ask was ambitious, I will say we did not go in expecting to get everything. It is a small win, as it does allow us to sustain public transit, and there was not going to be any service cuts, which was, really a risk that we were facing. But there's certainly, a much larger fight ahead to get the funding to actually expand service. And like I said, implement the Transit Master Plan, which is really where those emissions reductions would come in. And then this doesn't necessarily fit into a sector, so I kind of just threw it in there, but another top priority of ours was the Environmental Justice Act, which requires the Department of Environmental Management to create a list of environmental justice areas, and then any projects that are proposed within those areas would have to undergo a cumulative impact study. And there would have to be like a rigorous public comment period. And this bill has passed the Senate 3 years in a row now, but it has yet to even get a hearing in the House. It's been very frustrating as the Senate, the testimony is not public, and they don't publicly post the testimony unless someone actually goes and speaks, and you hear what they have to say. And so the opposition has been very behind the scenes, and it wasn't very clear who was opposing this. You can guess industry, labor. They're concerned about not being able to continue to build projects, specifically in the Port of Providence. And so it didn't even get a hearing in the House this year, and it didn't pass the Senate either because they knew it wasn't going to pass the House, and so they decided to focus their efforts elsewhere. But we have since learned who some of the key players in the opposition are, and so we're committed to working with a sponsor in the off session to try and come to a compromise that doesn't weaken the bill at all. because we really want to make sure that we're not citing, more polluting facilities in communities that are already disadvantaged by so many polluting facilities. And so that this bill is going to be another top priority for next session. And I did also want to mention, my organization, and I think Climate Action Rhode Island as well, focuses more on climate mitigation. But there were some resilience and adaptation bills that did pass this session that I wanted to mention, because we are already experiencing the impacts of climate change, and we do need to start planning for that. And so the first one was the Act on Coasts, which directs the Rhode Island Chief Resiliency Officer to create a statewide coastal resiliency plan. The plan would be reviewed and updated every 2 years. And so that was a good win in terms of, the climate resiliency front and planning for, intensified storms, sea level rise. And then there was also the long-term economic development bill, which adds climate change, sea level rise, and coastal resiliency to the strategic plan analysis for economic development policy. And then it also adds the director of DEM, Terry Gray, and the executive director of the Coastal Resources Management Council to the Economic Development Planning Council. So they'll be able to kind of bring that climate perspective to those conversations. And then the building sector, which is the big sector that is where most of our work lies ahead of us. So the building sector makes up 37% of the state's emissions, and Rhode Island really lacks any sort of plan to address emissions from this sector. Big picture, to meet our climate goals, we must transition away from fossil fuels towards electrification in both new and existing buildings. And I want to stress that existing buildings are really crucial here and a much larger piece of the puzzle. When we talk about 2050 and achieving net zero by 2050, 70% of our building stock that's going to be in place in 2050 is already built today. And so it's really important that we start electrifying and retrofitting our existing building stock, in addition to making sure we're not making the problem worse by ensuring new construction is built all electric. So given that, our big priority bill this session was the Building Decarbonization Act. And it was broken up into 2 different sections that, section 1 addressed emissions from existing buildings, and section 2 addressed emissions from new buildings. So section 1 had benchmarking and building performance standards. Basically, it's where large buildings, larger than 25,000 square feet, have to report their energy usage and emissions to the state. They do that by submitting their utility bill to a platform that has this formula that can then calculate their emissions. And then 3 years after collecting that data and finding out where the emissions are coming from, the state would then use that data to establish basically a standard by which those large buildings have to gradually reduce their emissions by over time. They also would issue guidance on how they can do that. And then, so that starts to address emissions from our large existing building stock, which, as I said earlier, is really critical. And then section 2 was all about new construction. And so it kind of phased in requirements for making new construction all electric. It started off with electric readiness. So all buildings would at least have the wiring and the capability to transition to fully electric in the future. And then it went to requiring all public buildings to be built all electric. The third tier was allowing municipalities to have the ability to require that all buildings within their jurisdiction be built all electric. And that was just enabling legislation. It wasn't requiring any municipality to do that. And then the fourth tier was requiring all new construction statewide to be all electric. We knew we weren't going to get that this year, but we put it in hopes that we would get tiers 1 through 3. But we got tiers 1. We got so the Senate did pass a sub-A that was pretty substantial, that included both the benchmarking and the building performance standard and the electric ready construction. So everything that I've highlighted in blue here passed the Senate. And that, while it didn't include everything that we had hoped for, it was really a huge first step in decarbonizing our existing building stock and setting new buildings up for success. It's much cheaper and just makes much more sense to set buildings up now with the ability to go all electric when we know that that's the solution that we need to head towards. And so we were happy with the Senate sub-A. We felt like we reached a good compromise, particularly with labor and the builders. And the House experienced some other last-minute opposition from the governor's office, just concerning the state's ability and capacity to implement the program. And so the House decided to pass their own version of the bill that basically calls for the EC4, the Executive Climate Change Coordinating Council, to issue a report on how they would implement this policy. And the Senate then subsequently passed the House sub-A. So the EC4, the next slide, is now going to be creating a report on recommendations for implementing benchmarking and building performance standards. And the report has to include a summary of Rhode Island's building emissions, an inventory of properties that would be subject to benchmarking and building performance standards. So that's basically all buildings larger than 25,000 square feet in the state of Rhode Island. A summary of current fuel sources for buildings. So are they using natural gas? Are they using oil, propane? And then really figuring out the various state agencies' roles and responsibilities when it comes to benchmarking and building performance standards, and also estimating how much staff and their annual budget for implementing the program. And that report is going to be due back to the General Assembly on February 15th of next year. That should say 2025. And so, while this was disappointing that we didn't get the actual policy passed, we know that this is a proven policy that has already been implemented in several jurisdictions. And quite frankly, if Rhode Island felt like they needed to do a report, they should have already done one because time is ticking. This isn't nothing, and it does set us up for success for next year. It does get the ball rolling on that building inventory, finding out, what fuel sources buildings are using, and really making the state agencies take this seriously and start to figure out what capacity they do have and what they need to be able to successfully implement this. And so, we don't think this is a total loss, and we see it as setting us up for success for next year in passing the policy. But I will say that the legislature and the governor needs to pass this next year. We could not keep kicking the can down the road here. And this policy, while necessary and great, is only one piece of the building decarbonization puzzle. It really only addresses large existing buildings. We still need to electrify residential buildings, new buildings. And so there's definitely going to be more policies needed. And so this must pass next year, or else we're not going to achieve the Act on Climate. And that's the messaging that we need to be telling the legislature and the governor. Another policy in the building front that we have been advocating for is the Clean Heat Standard. So this we actually see as that larger macro policy solution to addressing emissions from the building sector. It basically, if you're familiar with the renewable energy standard and how that requires an increasing amount of renewable energy, a clean heat standard requires an increasing amount of clean heat on behalf of the fossil fuel heating suppliers. So gas utility and the oil and propane dealers would essentially be required to provide consumers with an increasing amount of clean heat services each year in line with our climate goals. And they would do that through a credit system. So we would create what's called clean heat credits. And basically they would be eligible to earn clean heat credits for helping people weatherize their homes, install heat pumps, geothermal, all the things that we know we need to be doing in order to reduce emissions from the building sector. And this is a policy that already passed in Colorado and Vermont, and Massachusetts is actually exploring it through regulation. Their executive branch is pursuing it. And I want to note that not everything has to be done through the legislature. The Act on Climate gave state agencies a lot of power to be able to pursue policies themselves. And one, thing that's going on that is really relevant to the building conversation is the future of gas docket at the Public Utilities Commission. So this is a docket that was opened basically in light of the Act on Climate to explore what to do with the gas distribution system, given we have these climate mandates and the gas system is really not compatible with that. And so we're advocating for a clean heat standard through this process as well. The Public Utilities Commission only has authority over gas, not over oil and propane. So it wouldn't be a full clean heat standard. It would be over gas. The legislature would have to pursue it for oil and propane as well. But I just want to kind of provide some hope here and give you a quote from the PUC chairman, Ron Jaratowski, when he kicked off this process. He said that mandating a statewide moratorium on new natural gas hookups and creating regulatory pathways to abandon the natural gas distribution system is on the table. So this is something that they're taking very seriously, and we're currently in the phase where they've just concluded the modeling on. They basically hired a consultant to model various scenarios of how we can achieve the Act on Climate with the gas distribution system or without the gas distribution system is really where we need to be going. So that modeling was just concluded, and all scenarios included a high level of electrification. And so we know that electrification is largely the answer, and we need to be pursuing that as fast as we can. And now we're kind of in the policy recommendations phase where they're having their consultant draft a report to recommend policy solutions to both what the PUC should be doing, the Public Utilities Commission, as well as the Executive Climate Change Coordinating Council, as well as what the legislature needs to pass and get into law to be able to reduce emissions from the gas sector. So there's a lot going on outside of the legislature that kind of connects to what we're advocating for through policies.
Can I just ask, so, you know how like the Maple Project's kind of getting pushed right now for the new expansion of natural gas right now in Rhode Island?
Yes.
How are we gonna do that and tackle the Maple Project that is currently trying to expand?
That's a great question. I have the same question.
They're saying that, they're like, oh, we're gonna do this, but then they're also approving this other project saying this is fine.
Right. So my understanding is the Maple Project hasn't gone through any approval at the state level. And so that might be the disconnect there. I'm not super familiar with what's going on there, but I know the Public Utilities Commission hasn't had any say over it. I think it might be FERC. And then there was a Coastal Resources Management Council hearing, but that wasn't on the actual gas going through the pipeline. That was on the impacts to the sea floor. So it was hard for us to go and argue against expansion of gas when the subject that the CRMC was voting on was just impact to the sea floor. So it gets tricky, but I hear ya.
Maybe that's why they did it that way.
Right.
Well, that's the CRMC's jurisdiction, is more impact on marine life, not climate change, and yeah. But yeah, if there is a hearing at the Public Utilities Commission, I just don't know if it goes through them or if it's through the federal.
I think it's the federal,
Yeah.
it's happened yet,
Okay,
I think.
yeah, definitely something to keep an eye on and oppose however we can. Okay. So, speaking of other things outside of the legislature, there's also the Executive Climate Change Coordinating Council. And as I said, they, passed their plan in December of 2022 that was quite lacking and does not get them to that 45%. But they are planning on creating a more detailed plan on how to achieve the Act on Climate that's going to be due in December of 2025. And they will be hiring a consultant to do some more in-depth modeling. One thing that we're advocating for here is subsector limits. So right now it's just a greenhouse gas emissions limit sector-wide. So it's kind of unclear how much we actually need to reduce emissions from buildings versus transportation versus the electricity sector. And there's a little bit of finger pointing, we feel like, between the different sectors. And so it'd be really helpful to have clear targets. For example, how much gas emissions do we need to reduce by over time to meet the Act on Climate? And so that's a key thing that we'll be pushing for in this plan, as well as a clean heat standard, a building performance standard, all of the things that we've been talking about. And speaking of the EC4, there we go. There was a bill this session introduced by Senator DeMario, Chair DeMario. She chairs the Senate Environment Committee, and Representative Courtfriend, that would fund the EC4 to allow them to be able to do a good plan and expand their capacity to implement policies like the building performance standard, which is, you know, one of the reasons why the bill didn't pass this year was because they didn't have capacity. And so basically what this bill would do is it would allocate excess money from the underground storage tank fund, which is basically a fund that is paid through taxes by underground storage tank owners. So think, you know, gas stations and fossil fuel infrastructure. And that money, Senator DeMario did some research and found that money has largely just been sitting there and hasn't been being used. It's there to help fund cleanups for any potential spills. But once the fund reaches $8 million, the tax stops being collected, and it was almost there, and the money has just been sitting there. And so she decided to introduce a bill that allocated $2 million of the funding upfront to the Executive Climate Change Coordinating Council, and then in subsequent years up to a maximum of $1 million, as long as the fund doesn't dip below $5 million. And so we were very supportive of this bill. It passed the Senate, but unfortunately was held in the House. And so we will be coming back again next year to advocate for it. And that is it. Thank you all very much for thank you all for making calls to the governor and the speaker's office. It made a difference. They felt like they couldn't ignore us, and so that's how we got that report and that resolution calling on the EC4 to create that report, which does get the ball rolling in the right direction. So thanks so much. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Are there any obvious critical path points that can be pushed upon to move the ball far enough forward so that those who feel like they've successfully slowed the process down say, oh, I can't prevent this from proceeding?
Interesting question.
The reason I ask that is that last slide. That sure, we'll pass it off to the EC4 and they don't have the resources.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
that's great. That's convenient. And so I'm wondering if there are other critical path spots that are starving for resources or hold the political key to moving people on.
That's a good question. I'd have to think about that one a bit. I will say that I think one key turning point is on whether we're going to achieve the Act on Climate or not, is going to be this 2025 climate strategy that's going to come out in December. If that is a good plan that sets us in the right direction, then I think things will go up from there. The state will start getting more capacity to actually be able to implement things. If that is not a good plan, anyone is allowed to sue the state starting January 1st of 2026 for not complying with the Act on Climate. And so I think that plan, if it's not adequate enough, I think potentially the Attorney General, maybe even some climate groups, will start to put together a lawsuit to basically force the state to start complying.
There are actual consequences.
There are actual consequences, yes.
Well,
Cause.
so just the public, so they don't have to wait until they miss the 2030 deadline to
You,
sue.
you're in the Act on Climate statute, you're allowed to sue, I believe, January of 2026. The tricky thing is the climate plan comes out December of 2025. So you might not have enough, like, you kind of gotta have enough to have a good lawsuit and, but that's when you're allowed to sue.
Do you know with this, the 2025 report, are the people from the government involved in creating that report and for agencies, are they consulting with climate scientists and actual experts? They're not just like sitting in a room somewhere thinking about it on their own.
That's a great question. I feel like that's kind of what happened with the 2022 report.
Right, it's like,
And
yeah,
so,
fluff.
right, and so the 2025 report is expected to be much more robust. They are hiring a consultant to help them with the modeling to make sure that's more robust. And so we'll see when it comes out, but it is expected to be much more detailed. And Green Energy Consumers Alliance is helping host community engagement sessions to get input from the community to impact their report. And so they're doing a lot of stakeholder input sessions. And so hopefully if we see it's not going in the right direction, we'll be able to kind of shape it.
But do you guys have any input on who they hire as a consultant?
That I don't know. They just put out the RFP.
Yeah.
And so they might host a public comment session. Not sure.
So I would like to understand better what went down with the building decarb bill with, passing the Senate compromise version passed the Senate. And then, it gets to the House and we're always told, oh, in Rhode Island, the speaker is the most powerful politician and the governor is, kind of also ran. But, and Shekarchi would like to be perceived as a climate advocate, climate speaker. So, what was your sense of the kind of dynamic between the speaker and the governor on that? And I remember, when the Act on Climate passed, the governor also tried to muck up the works at the last minute with a veto threat, and the AG came in with a kind of on a knight on a white horse to save the day.
Yes.
And so did the AG's office get involved, or, kind of what was the dynamic among the actual decision makers that led to the crummy report? Better than nothing, but, kicking the can down the road.
Yeah. So I'll answer the AG's question first. Attorney General Noronha is awesome on climate. And so we went to him knowing that he was awesome on climate, and he is supportive of the policy, but this is where timing doesn't work out well with the future of gas docket expected to conclude this summer, and getting concrete policy recommendations from experts through that. They wanted to wait until that process concluded before they jumped in to support any sort of building decarbonization policy, which was frustrating. We tried to push back and say, the modeling for that process has already concluded and showed that electrification is largely the answer. This bill is about
They went through
electrification.
that whole process in the Raimondo administration with the heating sector transformation
Yes.
report.
Yes. So ultimately, he decided not to weigh in. But it does sound like it's going to be something that he will weigh in next year once he has the future of gas docket concluded.
And where was Shekarchi? Did he want to, or did he not want to?
So Shekarchi, you guys met with Shekarchi. He seemed to be on board, but he kind of yeses you to death sometimes. And I think what ended up happening was two things. I think Shekarchi was mostly on board had some business lobbyists in his ear against it. And so was weighing that, but I think was mostly on our side. Then at the 11th hour, the governor's concerns came out, which was very frustrating because we had reached out to the governor multiple times before the session even started, but he didn't respond until the bill started moving in the Senate. And he started saying, you know, the state doesn't have the capacity to implement this, which is funny because he's the one who's in charge of the state's capacity. And so my understanding is the governor kind of had some more sway over the House than the Senate. And so the Senate kind of just forced it through. The House.
Did the EC4 take a position?
The EC4, we tried hard to get them to take a position. The most that they were able to say, they did submit testimony saying that the building sector needs to be addressed. But they didn't go into specifics.
So what,
Yeah.
with the governor, what was his concern?
Capacity, the state doesn't have the capacity,
Budget capacity, or what do you mean by?
right, like staff capacity, budget to fund the staff. And then,
I think we're so focused on bridges right now.
So what's that, well, is that legitimate? I guess my question is there any legitimacy to that concern? Or, I mean, did we forget to make sure we have the capacity before we propose this stuff? Or?
no. So basically, we worked with the Office of Energy Resources in the off session to amend the bill to make it much more gradual. This version of the bill is actually very different from the previous 2 years that it was submitted. We worked with the Institute for Market Transformation and the US Green Building Council, who have worked on this policy across the country, to really make it administratively doable for the state. We made it more gradual. We phased in the amount of buildings over time. We even informed the state about funding that was available through the Inflation Reduction Act. There's actually technical assistance funding available for implementing building performance standards, which they missed the first round of funding for. The second round of funding is due in November. We're still pestering them to apply. And so we tried, like, I honestly,
Have the free money?
they're not, this is they're not adding the thousands of dollars of staff capacity to be able to access millions of dollars. It's very frustrating.
Right. It's incompetent. It's
Small
malpractice.
business, small mind.
Peter has a question. Unmute yourself, Peter.
Thanks very much, Amanda. This was a great presentation. You really covered where we are now and what you and a lot of other folks worked hard to achieve during this session. I think Carrie's role has been wonderful, standing up, writing letters, walking in and shaking the hands of and the minds of our legislators. But we're still a little disappointed, aren't we? And for good reason. There are a couple things, and you were nice to cover the importance of stuff other than bills in the House and bills in the Senate. Let me just mention a couple others. Public engagement is a big one. We've been, I don't know how many years Janine Sobers has been struggling to get a bill for education of the kids so they could talk their parents into supporting the need for addressing climate change, supporting the transition from fossil fuels to clean energy. Ain't there yet. And the kids could probably talk us grown-ups into it. But we need to be thinking about the people as a whole being engaged. 24% of Rhode Islanders polled by a new group at Salve Regina came up with a willingness to think that climate change was an important issue for Rhode Islanders to address. 24% is not a majority. I mean, we're really losing with that. There are some other opportunities, getting this stuff out where people can see it and maybe it will help change their minds. The funding of things you mentioned, how the bill for fuel tanks failed to come through this year. Let's hope we do next year. But you know, we are, thanks to the governor, getting something like $1 million a year for funding for the EC4. Come on, how do you possibly manage the transition? $3 billion worth of money going off to the fossil fuel world. How do you manage this without having a well-funded organization? Can't do it. Number two, we really have an opportunity to put that up before the public, and we should be expecting that the sort of poster presentation of where Rhode Island is with its efforts to move with climate change resistance are listed and presented. What's the budget? What bills have been paid to get it from the federal government? What seed money do we have to put down? Group from Citizens Climate Lobby spoke with Senator Reid a few days ago, and he was raising the question about how good a job are we doing as a state to attract that federal money. I think you said it already. Somebody did. You can't do it without adequate staff and adequate funding of the staff. So we've got some things to work on, and let's do it together. But you guys from Cary have really proved your ability to push it hard and to accomplish a lot. And thank you very much for everything you do.
Can I just comment one thing in response to him? I just want to say really quick is that we're not just tackling a lack of information in the public. We're tackling most of all misinformation and people actively trying to spread misinformation. And I think that is one of the biggest issues because everyone knows there's climate stuff going on, but a lot of the public doesn't know what to think or believe. And there's so much fear-mongering being spread so strongly and so well in propaganda that is what we're really fighting with. That's our biggest enemy, in my personal opinion. And honestly, we all don't have answers, and it's not a perfect world of like black and white. People want black and white answers when we don't have the answers yet. So it's a convincing game of like, who do we trust? And it's always trying to stay consistent with our honesty and our answers when we're answering people's questions. But it's a huge, huge endeavor.
So that bill to fund the CRMC, was it, or was it the EC4? It was to fund the EC4 out of the underground storage excess, and that died in the House. So where, was that on Shikarchi's radar, that bill? I mean, that when something dies, that means he said, this doesn't go forward.
Yeah, my
I
understanding.
can turn off the recording so we can talk about this.
I will say that bill, it wasn't that much funding for the EC4, so that bill didn't